So this is again, easier to see on the PC screens, and it's first a slide of context. And if you can't see it, I'll sort of explain it anyway. And the ideas are relatively simple. This is a graph where on the vertical axis you have competitiveness as measured by the World Economic Forum, which is an institution certainly gaining prominence and is doing these studies. So they have the competitiveness of nations on the vertical axis, and on the horizontal axis you have the social expenditures as percentage of GDP, so that's OECD data. That again is fairly standard. Now what's interesting is actually the red line, which doesn't come up, but it basically says that there is no contradiction between competitiveness and social welfare. In fact, it's the contrary, which is that the more competitive you are, the more you will actually do social welfare. So that it basically says that competitiveness is a social policy de facto, that sort of social expenditure is a consequence of competitiveness. And so in that sense, there is no separation between social and economics, is that, the more you are competitive, certainly by countries, and this you can see very much on the top right, the highest competitive countries in Europe, whether they're Sweden, whether they're Germany, whether they're Denmark, UK, Finland, the most competitive economies are also the one with the highest social welfare spending. And I think that's very important to recognize. So that the first thing is that sort of a competitiveness policy sort of cannot go at all against sort of social welfare. The idea is that the more competitive, the bigger the pie, the more you can share. And I think this is also a comment on, in a certain way, the income distribution, is that a certain way of increasing the income distribution is refusal to share the pie. So this is sort of a European view of saying, let's grow together, and as we grow together, there's more to share. So that's the first point to say. I always regret that, sort of most of the top countries are Protestants, and maybe we can say that the Protestants are better sharers, or share more. You can also say that the Protestants, are more lean. They have less bureaucracy because they don't have a pope and a bishop and a deacon, between them and God. So that is for a Catholic is a bit sorry, but maybe that's the right benchmark to apply. That's the first point. The second point is to go to the left, and if you go to the left, you have the new European countries, whose competitiveness today, and for some in Europe, but mostly in their own country, in their own currencies, is less. And very interestingly, even those countries do not actually favor increased social welfare spending. So we found that in this graph, the new European countries were extremely mature, and this is completely consistent with the comments of President Josipovic this morning. Very humble, very realistic. We have to earn our way. Let's work hard, etc. So again, on the left side, you have countries like Poland, Czech, Slovakia, who are all doing well, but whose social welfare, it's very important for them that their social welfare expenditures do not go beyond the red line, meaning that it doesn't grow beyond their competitiveness level. So interestingly, very few countries in the middle. So you have the new countries and the old countries. And then the real problematic countries are the ones that are below the red line. So when you're below the red line, it actually means that you have a certain level of social welfare spending, and you're just not competitive enough to justify that spending. And so that is going to create sort of problems, which is, it may be that, you're not allocating well, but overall the investment in social welfare is too high. And of course, then you have the dilemma, which is either you want to go vertically above the red line, which is get a jump of competitiveness, which you can pretty much only do by competitive evaluation. So if you're in the Eurozone, you can't sort of jump up. But that is, of course, one of the scenarios, being now discussed is is, you know, let's sort of go back to our currency, then we can devalue, and then we immediately get back above the line, and then we're in okay zone. The other one is to, of course, saying I'm not competitive, I'm overspending, and therefore I have to go to the left, which is budget cuts, austerity, etc. And so that, I think that graph sort of basically sort of presents in a very interesting way, first, that there is no dilemma, there is no trade-off between social welfare and competitiveness. Secondly, that there is just, as Esko said in the previous, there just are bad allocations. There's excess spending, or maybe you're not allocating the pie very well, and you don't get the competitiveness that you wish. For example, you may have high spending on education, but it's not targeted at the right level of education, and then you get the competitiveness gap. So that was sort of a slide of context, but it's sort of saying again, you know, sort of, if Europe is about competitiveness, this will have as an outcome increased social spending, and therefore the answer is thank you, Europe. Because as Europe makes us more competitive, you know, we'll also go in the right direction in terms of the social welfare spending. And the whole discussion is social welfare as an outcome, as a consequence, or social welfare as a prerequisite. And of course here I'm presenting it as a causality going from competitiveness to social welfare, which is, I think, correct, because that's the only one that is sustainable. I should say that as a second point, if you compare, and if we want to make a point which is not in this graph but is about allocation, there was a very interesting survey European-wide who basically sort of compared the health services of the rich compared to the health services of the poor, and sort of tried to estimate the gap. So there were some countries, for example, like France, you know, where basically both the rich and the poor complain. Now, maybe that's because they're French, or basically that is because the access is not good. We don't know, you know, that sort of level of detail. But very interestingly, there was one country which was amazing, which is an example for all European countries, and that's Slovenia. And in Slovenia, either Slovenians never complain. No, I don't think that's necessarily true. That's not human. But the Slovenians and the poor and the rich are both equally have perfect access to medical services. So in that sense, part of the answer is, let's do more benchmarking. There are some new European countries in very sort of difficult conditions who actually manage the expenditure and the access to health services very well. And these things are not sufficiently known. And then I would sort of say, you know, again, you know, if Europe allows me to really compare, because I think that's, for me, the real issue, is that people don't travel enough, and people don't benchmark enough, and people don't experience the differences enough. If this was the case, then, you know, people would discover good examples, bad examples. So we need an Erasmus for politicians, you know. It's not that everybody should travel to Brussels. They should just travel wide and say, where are things done better in other countries? So that was sort of, that's a bit the spirit of this. So we need a fellowship for politicians, etc., you know, so that they travel and do their Erasmus, etc. By the way, very sad of Erasmus. The travel is great. Most people want to go to Barcelona, you know, because the nightlife is terrific. The problem is the integration is terrible. Most students complain about the lack of integration when they travel. They say the travel is great, but, you know, I don't understand, you know, or I don't fit, or I can't get into the courses that they want, or the vacations are not on the same schedule, and my mom wants me at home, or whatever. So we need better integration of the educational processes. And that, of course, is thank you to Europe as well. The Bologna Agreement, I think, is a step in the right direction, with the idea that, you know, you do your undergraduate in one country, and then you open up. There's a harmonization of master's choices at the European level, so you can have more choices. So that's the first slide. Sorry to be a bit long, Bob. Second slide. Now this is, in a certain way, a contradiction with the previous slide, which is, this is all about, you know, do social system deter competitiveness? And very interestingly, the ones who are most strongly in agreement are the Polish, you know, who basically sort of say 88% strongly agree or agree that actually social systems deter competitiveness. On the other side, you know, you have the people that are not too far, the Hungarians, you know, who basically, you know, sort of strongly disagree or disagree of 70%. And I think that shows the interval of differences about the link between, you know, social systems and competitiveness. And it's very hard to see a pattern there. I would, for example, the Dutch, you know, would sort of say 59% strongly agree or agree that social systems deter competitiveness. On the other hand, sort of close by, you have the Finnish, you know, who basically disagree, strongly disagree. So it's very hard to find a pattern in this graph, except that most people seem to say that social systems deter competitiveness, though every nation has a social system. So what is the interpretation we make of this is that Europe just isn't ready for a European social system. That this is not a topic, and I think this is shown through other questions. Focus on the market, focus on competitiveness, focus on fiscal responsibility, focus on a monetary policy, but don't start managing from the center, in this case Brussels. Don't start managing from the center your social system, because whatever you do from the center, you're going to create dissatisfaction in all countries. And so this is the interesting hypothesis that comes out is, you know, do social systems deter competitiveness? This is an EU questionnaire. So what they probably mean is EU social systems, you know. So we don't want that. So that's basically the response that we, or the interpretation we have. Coming back to the first slide, it's saying, you know, focus on competitiveness and social policy will follow in a way that is consistent with competitiveness. And given that you don't have harmony, given that you have huge discrepancies in competitiveness, you know, don't try to start regulating. At best, people would say, is that let's agree on some human social norms, you know, that there are things that we should all agree on. You know, for example, that maybe, you know, when you're 8 years old, it's too early to you know, to be employed because there is no free choice and things like that. So whatever it might be, minimal norms we can agree with, but active regulation of one social system we don't like. And basically there is no average view, except we all agree on a negative answer to what could be an average European view. And I think this is important to realize, and that will be my final comment, is Europe is not about the average, you know. It's not about people, it's not about putting people at the average. It's increasing the average level of competitiveness, but it is not actually reducing the high performance to the average level. So it's trying to improve the average, but by not putting people at the average, it's by celebrating the real winners. And if you then go back to the first slide, this goes back to what has been said before. You know, thank you Germany, thank you Finland, thank you Sweden for showing us how well you can combine, you know, competitiveness with a social policy. And I think that is not sufficiently said. So again, given that I spend a lot of time in France, I say it should be mandatory for the French to go on vacation to Sweden, you know, so they can learn how you combine competitiveness with a social policy. Thank you.